You must be tired, no?
Well, I'm not tired. My wife is tired. She's, in America now, so she just got off the plane in New York. I can imagine how tired she is.
Yeah,
She'll be there for a
my
week.
son just came back too. Matthew
Oh.
Mordecai, he just came back.
He was on the West Coast, or what?
East Coast.
Oh, on the East Coast.
Yeah.
So we began discussing Netilas Yadayim, you're washing your hands. And we spoke about different times and different occasions on which you have to wash your hands. For example, you wake up in the morning and you wash your hands. Now, we mentioned that there are two explanations for washing your hands, if you recall. One is because you're a new creation. It's like every day you're someone new, and the day that you're going to face is the day of avoda, of service to Hashem, and the Kohen, when he faces the day of service to Hashem, he has to wash his hands before he goes into the Beit HaMikdash. The other explanation is because you're going to daven, and you have to wash your hands before davening. And if you go with the second explanation, then maybe it's a little bit early to wash your hands when you first get up. You should wait until you're closer to the davening. Do you remember this, that we discussed this? Okay, very good. Now, what we want to discuss tonight are other occasions where the halacha requires you to wash your hands.
Excuse me, I don't know if you spoke about it last week, but what about, aren't you supposed to wash your hands before you even get out of bed?
Well, I don't know if before you get out of bed, before you get out of bed, you recite Moda'ani.
Yeah.
And then here there are two possibilities. Either you wash your hands immediately, like for example, Hasidim, will leave
a
bowl with a washing sefer, underneath their bed so that they don't have to walk. Because the Zohar in the Kabbalah says that you shouldn't be walking 4 amos, which is probably from here to where you're sitting.
Snagden have picked up that
yeah.
In the U.S., it's becoming
very popular.
Like, of course you have to.
Right. So it's based on Kabbalah, really, that you shouldn't be walking 4 amos without washing your hands.
But that's not typical.
Yeah,
well, I'll tell you why I would leave it out, or when I would leave it out. If, let's say, you have to urinate, pardon the expression, right? So I don't know if you should be wasting your time, so to speak, with Kabbalistic notions about washing your hands. I think you want to take a beeline, to the washroom as soon as possible. But again, there's nothing wrong with someone who feels that because of the Zohar and the Kabbalah, he wants to wash his hands immediately, gets out of bed, washes his hands, and then he goes to take care of his biological needs. But once he finishes with biological needs, then he has to wash his hands a second time.
Right.
And the reason for that is because once you use the washroom, then you need to wash your hands. So those were the things that we discussed. We discussed washing your hands negovas when you wake up in the morning, and we discussed washing your hands after you come out of the bathroom, and washing your hands for tefillah, for davening. Those were the 3 occasions. And now we're going to move on to other occasions when you have to wash your hands. So we have something which is called Nikius. Nikius means cleanliness. You may know that during the Black Plague, a lot of the anti-Semites accused the Jews of causing this plague because percentage-wise, ratio-wise, less Jews came down with the Black Plague. The reason for that is simply because of hygiene. The Jews were very careful about keeping things clean. And you'll see here on the bottom of page 17, he has a whole essay here that he summarizes from the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish lived about 50 years ago, a little bit more, and he was one of the most leading great scholars of the last century, probably. And he has a whole long discussion here about something called Nikius and Tahara, how much the Torah puts emphasis on keeping things clean and pure. So that's the introduction to this section. And here, I'm going to run through some of the pages here if you want to take a look on page 18, page 19. Here are some of the occasions on which we have to wash our hands. For example, let's say we attend a funeral or we enter into a cemetery. Let's say we go into a washroom and we don't use the washroom. We already discussed that if you use the washroom, then you have to wash your hands. But here you just went into the washroom, and we're going to talk about our bathrooms in a minute. Our bathrooms might be a little bit different. Or get this, when you cut your nails, did you know that? That when you cut your nails, you have to wash your hands. We'll get to that too, but I'm just going through it one by one. You'll see he has it all listed here, going from right to left. That's what we're going on. So now, what does it mean you cut your nails? Does it mean you use a knife or a scissors or a nail cutter? What constitutes cutting your nails? Like, let's say, for example, you only cut one nail. You have to wash your hands.
Biting.
Well, what if you bite your nails? A lot of people bite their nails. But what if you file your nails, right? These are going to be different issues. So we'll get to that in a minute. And then we have what's called negia b'makomos mechusim. If you have contact with parts, we're on page 18 now. If you have a contact with parts of the body that are normally covered, like let's say, for example, you touch your chest or your legs and so forth, these parts of the body are not hygienic. You know, they come in contact with filth, and therefore you have to wash your hands. Then we have the shoes. I don't know if you knew this, that I don't know about tying shoes. We'll get to that later, but when you touch your shoes, let's say to put them on or take them off, you have to wash your hands. We'll see how many times on each hand and so forth. And then the question becomes, what about tying your shoes if you don't come in contact with the shoes, but only with the shoelaces? Then we have a case of tisporet, if you take a haircut. Did you know that? After a haircut, you have to wash your hands. A lot of people don't know that.
Not just the person cutting.
I don't know if the person cutting has to wash his hands. I think it's the
So I think the
Nikaf.
barbers that wash their hands.
It's done like they would have to, right?
I don't know
You
that the
touch your own hair during davening, you're supposed to like wipe it or clean, right? So in the stomach, you touch someone else's hair.
Oh, you mean to say
As well.
because the barber will mix up your hair, he'll
Yeah, they'll hold it and cut it.
uncut it. Maybe, yeah, you're right. Maybe. Okay, then we have lechas ha'afa ozen, which means the mucus that comes out of your nose. All this is non-hygienic, and therefore you should wash your hands. So let's take a look for a moment at the first of these cases. There's 7 cases. One is going into a cemetery. So on page 19, he has a piece from Rav Avad Yosef. Rav Avad Yosef says that if you come out of a cemetery, or when you finish with a levaya, when you escort the dead, you need to wash your hands. And he says, according to the strict letter of the law, you don't need to do it with a kli, because it's all about hygienics and cleanliness. But he says, I would give a blessing to someone who is more careful and made sure to use a kli. He says the following, he's allowed to dry his hands, but apparently there are some who want to air dry their hands rather than dry their hands. Now he says, what happens if you don't come all the way up to the coffin? You're at a distance from the coffin. He says, in that case, if he's outside the Beis HaKfaros, he doesn't have to wash his hands. So you've been at a levaya where there are many, many people up front, and you're in the back. So if you're in the back and you don't go into the cemetery, you don't have to wash your hands.
Nothing to do with if you're in the building?
No, he doesn't talk about going into the building. He's
This is
saying
in the presence of
of the dead body. The dead body is there. They're taking the dead body for
you
burial.
don't have to wash.
It depends how close you get. He says if you get in what? Oh, so if you get within like the distance between me and you, then he'd have to wash his hands. But if he's beyond that distance, he doesn't have to wash his hands unless he went into the cemetery.
But
Okay.
technically, isn't the building in the cemetery normally?
Yes, that's true. But you know what? What happens very often is they start the levaya outside the building. So you never even went into the building.
Mhm.
But even if you went into the building is not necessarily in a cemetery. Like, for example, if you heard of Shamgar in Yerushalayim, the building is not in a cemetery. Okay, next. he talks about washing the hands after you leave the cemetery. And he says that the minhag is that the custom is not to hand the kli directly from one hand to the other. That all has to do with ruach ra, some
Means
sort
from
of
one person to another.
right. You should put it down
Right.
and let somebody pick it up. You know, the sefel.
Right, isn't that the same thing when you're washing your hands before you daven? You're supposed to put the kli down before someone else. You don't take it from somebody else.
Maybe, I don't know. I only know it by a levaya, but maybe you're right.
Do you see before the Rav Ovadia says that?
Where are you?
I thought you said a minute ago that Ovadia.
Yeah,
said
what
that-
page are you on? Just if you don't
119.
mind. Yeah, thank you, 19.
That he said that the cemetery was an issue of cleanliness or just ruach ra, or is that's in the
Well,
category
I
of
think
cleanliness?
when you see this whole chapter, which covers this, there are actually 8, but let's say 7 categories. This is all a combination. 3 of the 7 are ruach ra. One of them is Beis HaKvaros, and the other 4 are what's called zuama. Zuama meaning filth. So
Right.
in
Okay,
both
no,
cases,
I thought I heard you say that there's also an aspect of cleanliness to ruach ra, but maybe I missed.
well,
maybe
yes, I
missed
mean, ruach ra is not. It depends what you mean by cleanliness. So in both cases, if you see this general introduction in the
Yeah,
blue,
it's
so he says
it's under
it's
Nikias.
all hakpeda. No, this is a general for both of the subcategories. Do you see my point?
Yeah, no, I mean,
So the general thing is hakpad al nikiyas haguf. In other words, both ruach ra and nikiyus are all under one category of nikiyus.
Nikias,
Yeah. Okay, fine. Let's take a look. He has a very beautiful overview of this in terms of the cemetery on page 20.
It's such very interesting. He says, later in the Yalkut Yosef, he says, if you go to a tzaddik that's buried not in the Beis HaKvaros,
Says you don't have to wash
you
your
don't have
hands.
to wash your hands.
Right.
Now, he doesn't explain why, but is it because there's like tzaddikim are nikra chayim, then misostam, or?
I don't know. That could be. I have a suspicion that it has to do with the fact that they're buried way, way, way below the ground.
Why do you say Bachevron? Like, why would his example be Reb Shimon, Reb he said that it's, if you're buried by himself, Nichlas Kut Tzadikim Shalom Toch Beis HaKvaros, Kamar Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, Meron, Reb Yochanan Ben Zebul Muka. Interesting. Okay.
The only thing I can tell you is he's not a big fan of visiting these
As I
kvaros.
said in the beginning, right?
He says he'd rather you steig in the base measures. You should be learning. Okay, fine. He quotes Reb Chaim, I think, at some point. I mean, the Gra. Just to take a look at the overview here very quickly here on page 20, he starts with the Gemara, and then he tells you that the Shulchan Aruch paskins that if you go out of a Beis HaKvaros, you have to wash your hands. And he says he should wash his hands with a kli if he can. And then he says not to dry his hands. But that's a real chumrah, not to dry your hands, especially in the cold winter. On the left side, he gives you cases where you don't have to wash your hands. And that's number 1, where you're not in the Beis HaKvaros and you're not within 4 amos of the deceased. And then he talks about Hanichnas likvaros tzadikim shebehem haniftar nimtza amok. Do you see the word amok over there? So anyway, he says you don't have to wash your hands. And then on the right side, on the bottom, he says that well, in the middle he says Lola kachas zakli miyada rochet. So Bob is saying that applies even in the morning when you wash your hands. That could be true. I just didn't come across that. All right, let's go on to the next case. Right, this is also an issue of ruach ra.
So when you leave the cemetery, you're supposed to wash, right?
Yes, that's what we're talking about. When you leave the cemetery, you wash,
No
preferably with a kli, with a
No matter
utensil.
how close you were to the.
Right. The cemetery
Deceased.
has one din, straight across.
Well, so the mashmos over here says Mish Aman B'chut Ba'arba Amos Shavames Velo Nichnas LaBeis HaKvaros. But on top of it says There's talking about them with Bikor Beis HaKvaros.
What page you on? Just so I should
On
follow.
20,
Page
whole
20.
church says, right, Bikor Beis HaKvaros, says Vivo, and then the left side, when do you not have to wash, and the, right, and then the right option of that, right, says Misha Aman, so okay, you're greater than 4 amos, the low nichas Beis HaKvaros, but isn't this whole thing talking about them to visit the Beis HaKvaros?
Well, no, he's giving you two
the
cases.
two.
Either you're in a Beis HaKvaros or you're outside Beis HaKvaros, but you come very close to the mess. Those are the two.
But here it says, Misha Aman mechut amos, so you're greater than 4 distance, below nichas Beis HaKvaros, and you didn't enter.
Right. So we X two of those,
Yeah, but-
instead of
but-
checking 2 boxes, we X 2 boxes.
But then how does this fit under the category of Bikor Beis HaKvaros?
No, the Beaker Beis HaKvaros is just like a
Like in the
generic.
parking lot or something?
No, Beaker Beis HaKvaros is just a general, title for this whole section. In other words, what happens when you
Also, when you go to a funeral, a lot of times it happens right outside the gate of the cemetery, right? And
So
then,
you're not-
and the body's there. And then they go into the cemetery. So I guess if you were more than 4 amos away from the body, you wouldn't have to wash.
right.
If you didn't go to,
If you didn't enter the
follow
Halachic
into the
cemetery.
yeah.
Uh-huh.
But you're not in the cemetery at that point.
Basically, wherever a coin could stand, you'd probably be popular, right? Like if a coin
From
goes
washing?
to the stomach, like if you stood next to him and he didn't violate anything, you probably wouldn't have to wash.
That's why I was asking about.
That sounds right.
That's why I was asking about the roof, because usually the Kohanim won't go inside the room with the mace, so.
Oh,
So do you have to
Right, but
wash your
that's
hands?
already Tumen Tara. I don't know. I
So
don't
it
know if
doesn't have
that's
to do with
relevant.
Washing your hands
I
necessarily.
don't think so.
Because usually what I see is in the US, they would usually have
A washing
Um,
station.
they usually have a washing station outside the funeral home, which is never near the
It's
cemetery.
nowhere near the
And
cemetery.
everyone
It's
who
it's
went
a
to the
million miles
funeral-
away.
Yeah, everyone who went to the funeral would pretty much wash their hands.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Okay.
Unless they were going to the cemetery, then they'd wash later.
So that could be Tumas oil, maybe, but so the second case of Ruach Ra that it requires washing is if you go into a Beis HaKisei, or you come out of a Beis HaKisei, or you go into a Beis HaMerchatz, which is a place where people are naked usually. So there also there's a Ruach Ra. However, if you take a look at the Gemara on the bottom of page 20 on the right, it says, Omar Rava Hani Bote Kisoi de Parsoi, the Persian style. How do you say Beis HaKisei in English? There's a word for it. What's it called? No, Beis HaKisei, I think there's a fancy English word for it.
Oh, that's Beis America. Beis HaKisei?
Yeah, a place where you defecate. What's
Bathroom.
Yeah.
All right.
Restroom, yeah.
No, but you see, a bathroom usually means like a room in a building. I'm talking about
Stall?
an outside, outside of the house. if you-
Outhouse?
An outhouse.
All right, that's not the word I was looking for, but it doesn't matter. And anyway,
Stay away from those places.
so what? Right. So what's the status of this Persian Beis HaKisei? He says that what happens is that immediately after they defecate, they wash it down, and therefore, Hani bote kisoi the parsoi kistumin dami, which means that it's like it's closed up, and therefore it's not ruach ra. There's no ruach ra. You don't have to. So what does that sound like to you in contemporary life?
The toilet.
Like our bathrooms. Our bathrooms, we flush the toilet and it goes immediately down. So this is going to be the whole discussion here on page 21. What's the status of our bathrooms? And here we have a basic debate here, which is quoted here on the bottom of page 21 in the Piskei Teshuvos. He says that on the one hand, it's very similar to a base kisei de parsoi, just like the base kisei soy, they would wash it down. So to here we flush it down, and therefore there's no ruach ra, and therefore you would not have to wash your hands when you go in the bathroom unless you use the bathroom. However, there are those who say the following: that what's different here about our Beis HaKiseis is not enough to allow you, and shall I say, alleviate you from your requirement of washing your hands because you come in. He says, first of all, the filth is there for a period of time. It takes you a few seconds until you actually flush the toilet. But more important, I think he says, Hacheder miyuad. Do you see that? It's about line 4, for those who like to see the text.
Yeah.
And this means you give it a name. A name is like a category. You really categorize this as a bathroom. It's a place which is designated for soa, for feces, for where you defecate. And that gives it a certain status in halacha. So we're not going to start differentiating between one Beis HaKisei and another Beis HaKisei, but rather we're going to make a flat rule straight across that as soon as you designate it as a Beis HaKisei, it takes on those dinim of Ruach Ra, and it requires.
How does the Gemara differentiate between them?
The Gemara is talking
Not that I
about a,
disagree, but-
the Gemara is talking about a situation which is like different than the classic, meaning in the whole world, they didn't have that sophisticated, so they could say when you go to Persia, so you use the Persian, but today all Batei Kisos are the same. Basically they all operate with the same mechanism. So that's what I think he's saying over here. Lamaisa, at the end of the day, he wants you to wash your hands anytime you go in to and out of the bathroom. But he says the following: what you could do is you can set up a partition in the bathroom, and the toilet is on one side of the partition. Excuse me, and the washing the sink, excellent. The sink is on the other side. Or let's say you have a washing machine. You have other functions other than the toilet function
In the room.
in that same room. But he says you have to set up a partition in the room. He doesn't go into all the details about what that partition looks like, how large it has to be, how thick it has to be, or whatever. Then he gives another example where you actually go through the bathroom in order to get to another room. Have you ever seen such a thing? It's not that common,
You
but
go through the bathroom to get to the laundry room,
let's say to the laundry room. So in those cases, he says, maybe we could rely on the leniency of equating our bathrooms with the Beis HaKisei Parsoi. Why? Because he's not really going into the bathroom. He's sort of like passing through the bathroom. Again, it's a very fine distinction.
So it doesn't count if you go in there to get, let's say, medicine or something.
No, he's going to say you should be machmir, you should wash your hands on your way out. Yeah. That's what he's saying. Unless the medicine cabinet is separated and partitioned off from the toilet. But if it's all one airspace, then that airspace
Well,
is
let's say it's
contaminated.
under
So
the
to speak.
sink, let's say. It's a
No, but I'm
cabinet
saying,
underneath the
as
sink.
long as you're
It's different.
standing in the airspace of the
Yeah.
toilet,
The toilet's not separated, so
it's
then
not separate.
basically.
A lot of places, the toilet is separated in its own room.
Yeah. I'll tell you what I don't like about learning these halachas, but just my personally, there's a word in psychology for someone who always constantly washes his hands. What's called OCD?
Yeah, obsessive compulsive.
Yeah, I have a feeling that after we finish this, we're all going to be OCD because you'll see in how many different occasions you have to wash your hands.
Follow every step in the
Like, for
rule.
example, he's going to quote a machlokas when you scratch your beard, whether you have to wash your hands. At the end, he says, okay, we can, but basically, look, you scratch any part of your body, scratch your head, scratch your ear, scratch your
Just
nose.
bring wipes-
You're always going to be washing hands, like, you're
bring
OCD.
wipes with you everywhere.
That's right. Maybe wipes are good enough, but look what he says. If you're on page 22, he doesn't like wipes. I mean, maybe he likes wipes for certain purposes, but not for this purpose. He wants you to wash your hands and with a kli. And you'll see this on the right column. He says, Yesh la'achmir v'litol yadayim achri knisa l'sherutim biyomenu, even in our times. And he says, where does he say that you use a kli? I lost it here for a second. Maybe it's on the next page, 23. No. Oh, he says, mutar b'shas hadchak. That's not the one I'm looking for. Maybe I just, I'm rushing through this too fast for myself. Where does he say you have to use a kli? Oh, here it is. On page 20, because I skipped it a little bit, in this chart he has on the right column at the bottom, he says, and Roy Lahachmer Lito Bekli.
That's close.
Right, but I think that applies straight across the board to anything that comes under the status of Ruach Ra. So he doesn't repeat himself over and over again. But he says that your washing your hands should be with a kli. Later on, he's going to say you have to wash your hands 3 times. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2.
That's what I was gonna ask you. So normally you do twice, right? Each hand.
But 3 times, I think, is the magic. Boy,
I thought,
but the
Chabad
first
does 3
time,
times.
you're just sort of getting off the surface of it. The second time, you're washing off the water that might have gotten stuck on your hands
yeah.
and is contaminated. And the third time, you finally get rid of everything.
So you
and-
do it 3 times?
He wants you to wash your hands 3 times.
Because no, I thought Chabad does, no matter what, they do it 3 times.
I guess if you're a Chabadnik, then you do it 3 times. But I think he's saying that even if you're not a Chabadnik,
Yeah.
let's talk a little bit about
When was that written?
cutting your nails, correct? We had a whole bunch of questions about cutting your
When was
nails.
the Pesach Shuvah written?
He's alive today, I think. Rabinovich is. Yeah, Hanotel Tziparnov. You see this in the middle of page 23. Bain miyada bein miragla. People don't realize that when you cut your toenails, you have to wash your hands. Bain b'misparayim, ubain biyadav, obashinov. He bites his nails. He's got to wash his hands. Did you know that? I didn't know that. I've been biting my nails for a long time. Yeah, filu not parnachas. Imagine he bit one nail. One nail, Rabosai. Tzarech litol shtei yodav ad haperek. He wants you to wash both your hands up to the wrist. And then he goes on and he says that ulefachot at sof kishrei etzbosiv, at the very least until the end of his knuckles. Ulechatchila gimel pamim b'seirigin.
What about your mouth? If you're biting your-
Just 1 second. Gimel pam b'seirigin. He's referring to tziparim. So wait a second. Remember, we had 3 categories of Ruach Ra. Help me out here, guys. You have to have, carry it with me, and then you'll ask. But if you take a look on the Ruach Ra in page 18, he's got 3 categories. He's got Levaya, or Beis HaKvaros. He's got Yitzia Beis HaKisei, and he's got Tzitzas Tziparnayim. And for Ruach Ra, he's asking you to do 3 times on each hand, B'seirigin, one after the other, one right, left. And he says that, you know what? If you don't want to do it in the ideal way, the perfect way, then V'ikar adin daiber chitzas mayim pam achas kol yad. You can get away with once on each hand, but that's not the way you should do it. And he says he doesn't understand how is it that people will bite their teeth and they don't wash their hands. And not only that, he talks about kosusin atziparnai, which means to file your nails down. He says maybe, we could find, he calls it lamed schus. You know what that means, lamed schus? Like, okay, they're ignoramuses, they didn't do it right. Well, we'll let them get away with it, kind of thing. Like the, the story about the, never mind. Anyway, remind me to tell you the joke about the 3 different weddings. I'm sure you all heard of it. All right. Now, while he's cutting his nails, he hears a bracha kaddish, he's allowed to respond. Again, he only says this in the case of Netilas Tziparnayim, but I assume it would apply in all cases that if he hasn't yet washed his hands, Mishum Ruach Ra, he can still respond to Kaddish, to Kedusha, and to say Amen. Now, what if he touches parts of his body that he usually covered? That's on page 24. He says the following, that the Beis Yosef quotes the Maria Buov. You can see his shul still in Sfat today. And he says that we should be very careful about washing our hands for cleanliness purposes. Okay, so now We're purely in the level of cleanliness, which means zuama. When we come in contact, our hands come in contact with filth. And he says, Noga begufo b'makomos mechusim, places where he sweats, and therefore there's an accumulation of zuama, of this kind of filth, and therefore, even if he only touched it with his fingers, the top of his fingers, he needs the Netilas Yadayim. Again, I'm becoming OCD. It's unreal. We didn't even get to scratching his head yet. Are you ready for this? We're only talking about now. Some people say, "Well, look, you know what? I only touched my knee. I didn't touch my thigh, right? Or I didn't touch the bottom of my leg." No. Tzarich lizar shelo lagas b'shok, which is the thigh, o b'yerech, or his knee and below his knee, u'makomas hanachusim. But again, I don't know. Today, people wear shorts. I saw a guy who wears shorts every day to shul. I don't know. Maybe it's no longer makomas v'chusim. Especially you're a kohen. So you say, you can't scratch your head. So wait a minute. What happens if I go like this across my head? He says, B'emtzat tefillah, you shouldn't do that. Certainly you shouldn't be scratching your head. He says, but there are places on your head, which is Rosho v'seyoso megulim. He says that there are parts of your hair which, if you just pat them down, and they're not covered usually, you're not talking about underneath the yarmulke or something like that, then he says you don't have to wash your hair. Hanosei dam lebedika. Did you ever? What's the word I'm looking for? Did you ever donate? Is that the word? Donate blood, right? So when you donate blood, right, you're going to expose your arm, and he says you have to be very careful not to have direct contact with your arm. If you have direct contact with your arm is usually covered. Then when you donate blood, you're going to have to wash your hands. What happens if you touch an animal? Here's where Lubavitch is very mach. You touch a cat. Okay, maybe I shouldn't say the next word. Or a dog. That's not politically correct here in Efrat. Everybody has at least one dog. But you touch a dog, then the question is, do you need Netilas Yadayim? He says, Tov lahachmir. He says he really encourages you to wash your hands. And he says, even if you touch an animal which is technically kosher, like a sheep or a chicken, you should really be washing your hands.
Is he talking
Wow.
about washing
just-
it before something?
No.
Okay, so if
You
you're a
shouldn't be
farmer,
walking
if
around.
You're a farmer, you're constantly you touch the sheep, wash your hands, you touch the.
Well, I
You
would
know,
say
I
if you're a
imagine that
farmer, then you're
before
going
you put
from
a dog
one.
in-
No, you're going from one sheep to the other. You know what I'm saying? So you're not gonna take a break and recite a bracha or learn Torah.
Right, but with the
So
amount- with the
you're going
amount,
from
with the amount of situations where he wants you to wash your hands.
right. It's
I
just
could easily
endless.
say, I would just say it's all categorized as one giant time period where I'm probably gonna violate this constantly, and then I wash my hands before I go to daven.
That might be.
The glove?
That might be true, but I think you should always be in a state of cleanliness. That's the idea here. Remember, I mentioned to you that his whole introduction here to this chapter is based on the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish says a person should always be in a state of Tara and Nekiyus. He should be in a state of
You're
cleanliness.
supposed to be learning constantly, so.
Right. You should see the coolest he comes up with. Like, for example, he's going to talk about cover, if you scratch your beard and so. He says, if we're going to ask everybody in the Beis Medrash to wash their hands every time they touch the beard, they won't be able to learn any Torah. So he wants to be making on beards, but he's not going to be making on scratching your hair.
Do gloves matter?
Yes.
That's
And
also.
like- and like
Gloves-
scratch your head like-
Gloves is a solution to all these problems.
And what about,
but
like,
you
just
know
scratch
what?
your head with the arm?
I don't know what psychological term they use for people who always wear gloves.
OCD also.
Oh, it's also
I
OCD.
understand.
So
I
you're going
think he
from one
had
OCD
OCD.
to another OCD. Mahoilu chacham b'takanoso. Here, let's take a look. He has a chart here which he summarizes this whole discussion on page 26. Do you have that? 26? By the way, he's Mekil in the case of Talmidim Ketanim, young children. He says that, you know what, they're in the middle of their learning and they scratch here, they scratch there, scratch their heads, they scratch their legs. He says, you know what, let them keep learning. Don't be mavatal them from their learning. Don't disturb them and distract them and make them wash their hands every single time. I guess he's saying that these young children are not, it's very hard to incarcerate a child. Anyway, he says, and what's makomos mechusim? He says that is relative. Oh, this is important. That's why I talked about shorts. Correct. Absolutely. He says the following: Kayom tzarich lizar lo lagas makomos mechusim b'emtzat tefillah or b'emtzat limud Torah. Imagine if you're in the middle of tefillah, so now you have to run out and wash your hands. I don't know what that means. What's that? I don't know what that is. Hanogeva balichayim, let's wash his hands. Torim dam, if he touches his roa, got to wash his hands. He says that a kohen should not duchen if he didn't wash his hands. That's already a separate din, like tefillah requires that you wash your hands. So too Berchas Kohanim requires that you wash your hands. And then Mishnah Berurah on the bottom of 26, Hanogea biyoda b'eis hachalitza, when he takes off his shoes and he touches his shoes, he has to wash his hands. Below naga b'hem, if he could take off his shoes or put them on, like loafers and stuff like that, or like me, I never tie my shoes, I just leave them closed. So in such case, you don't need netila. Hacholetz min olav v'nogea b'raglov, either he takes off his shoes and he touches his feet, or chofei frosha, someone who scratches his hair, or what's the word? Not shampoo. No, there's another word I'm looking for. Eino mishum ruach ra, rak mishum nekius. He says the basic difference between ruach ra, this is your question from before you, as opposed to nekius. In nekius, it's not tragic if you postpone it. But in the case of ruach ra, we want you to be in a state of tara and get rid of that ruach ra as soon as you can. Now, what about if you touch your socks? Well, how do you say socks in Hebrew? Karabayim, right? So that's on page 27. And he says that our socks are generally clean. That's interesting. And therefore, you don't need netila. But he says that nalayim, on the other hand, shoes are constantly in contact with the ground. And he says that there's a metaphysical curse to the ground. Arura hadoma bavurecha. Who got that curse? Adam Arishon. When? After he ate from the Eitz Hadas. And therefore, anything that touches the ground, which means the shoes, requires netila if you touch that place. Aval garbayim, he says, ein derech leches behem el al ritzpa nekia. Interesting. We don't go with socks out into the out on the ground, and therefore, when you touch your socks, you pull them up, you take them off. If they're not full of filth and they didn't come in contact with the ground, you don't have to wash your hands. Right. If you take off your shoes without touching your shoes, you don't have to wash your hands. Hamoded min olayim chadoshim. This is interesting. What would you say about someone who's trying out shoes in a shoe store, trying to decide whether to buy them or not? Bob, what would you say? Should you wash your hands?
The shoes, sometimes they use the shoe or they sample the walking inside the store, but hopefully not out on the ground. He says he had Nogea bin Alai by it. I'm sorry, where is it? Hamoded min alayim. This is number memches. Chadoshim. V'nogea mahem. He puts back his shoes without having to touch his old shoes. Wow.
Again, this is conditional that the new shoes were never used to walk on the ground.
When it says the ground,
What
does it
about
mean-
slippers?
Does he mean like the actual like earth of the floor? or
The
just
earth.
tile at a floor?
Yeah, I think he's talking about the earth because
If you have slippers,
he
you
says
never take
Arura
outside.
Adoma Bavurecha.
Because if you have slippers, you never take outside, it's like socks.
Oh, very good. But he says the following: Hanogeh ben ole bayis tzarech litol yadav. He says that when you touch your slippers, you have to wash your hands. Why? I couldn't figure this one out.
Probably because at some point you are not mocked and you do go outside with them.
Could also be, I think what he meant by new shoes is you literally take them out of the box and you put them on.
Right.
They've never been walked on even in
Right.
the house.
Uh,
Maybe he means, I mean, even the house is dirty. People walk around with their shoes.
The only thing is, he quotes the pasuk Arura Adoma Bavurecha. That's only the Adoma. Just 1 second. Ashor ruach ra ala karka shenemar v'arura tzorch netiz ruach ra ala karka.
Well, here the dust gets in. That's for sure.
Don't know. So you're saying anything that you wear even in the house comes under minalayim, and therefore nogeh benolei bias
You
is
went outside to greet somebody one time or walk them out of the house and I don't know, you stepped in the dirt. You took out the garbage, something in your sandals.
In socks,
Well, let me ask you a
don't walk
question
around the
here.
house.
You know,
Why would
the
the sock-
the halachic definition of a shoe
Wear socks, that's-
of a minal is a very complicated issue. It's nogea to many different halachas, like for example, in the mitzvah of chalitza in a yivama, or for example, wearing shoes on Yom Kippur. I mean, is there a status here, a legal status of what constitutes a minal? For example, if you take a look in paragraph number Memtes, he addresses the case of a kind of shoe that's open in the back. You know what I mean? Like the slippers, you'll see them here in Efrat once in a while, more than once in a while, but anyway, where
Clogs.
clogs are open in the back.
Yeah.
Okay, fine, clogs. I mean, I'll tell you the truth, where I sit in the morning here, I can tell you who's coming in without looking at him, just by the clogs that he's wearing. Sometimes I don't even have to see the clogs, just hear the clog, Anyway, he says, Ein tzarich litol yadav. Right? We said that when you put on the shoe, take off the shoe, you have to wash your hands. He's saying, no, this is not called a shoe. Why? Because it's open in the back.
But then that would sound like it has anything to do with the dirt. Before you said it has to do with, that has to do with the
What
dirt
about
and the
foam?
status of the dirt, and that has ruach around the dirt.
Right. He's saying the following, that if it comes in contact with the ground, that's called ruach ra. Why? Because arura adama vurecha.
What does that have to do with the shoe, with the legal status of the
Oh,
shoe?
but if on the other hand, you're talking about something that are nale bias and you don't go out and therefore it doesn't come in contact with the ground, and therefore what? It doesn't have that zuama, correct? It doesn't have that element of zuama. So then he says it depends upon whether it's considered in the general category of minal.
Oh, so the
And he
open
says if it's
back is
open in the
only-
back,
is only if you haven't worn them outside.
right? He's only talking about nale bias, He's,
I can understand that, because
But if
maybe
it's open
the
in the,
shoe you're used to, it looks like a shoe, and then you shouldn't be seen